In the last episode, we looked at Victorian poetry from the mid to late 19th century. During the same time period, there was a faction within the Church of England that was growing, and they were pushing for reform. Essentially, they wanted to recover a heritage of the church that they thought was now lost. Now, theology and historical reawakening were at the heart of the issue, though musical reform was an offshoot movement. In fact, some of the most popular English hymns we sing, like O Come, Emmanuel, All Glory, Laud, and Honor, and Praise to the Holiest in the Height, all come from the Oxford movement. In 1833, the Anglican priest John Keble gave a sermon at the University of Oxford, one that would eventually be published as National Apostasy, apostasy meaning a renunciation. Parliament recently passed legislation that would change the hierarchical structure of the Irish Church. Mind you, there is no separation of church and state. Keble believed these changes would liberalize and secularize the Church of England. He and his circle were critical of these changes, and in order to reform this wayward church, they authored a new origin story. They argued that the Church of England was a legitimate branch of the Catholic Church, not a Protestant offshoot. With this was a call for return to ancient Roman customs. Keble gained a following of fellow theologians, clergymen, and writers associated with the University of Oxford, hence the Oxford movement. It's also called Tractarianism because the circle published short books called Tracts for the Times. Many tracts were new interpretations of how one should understand Anglicanism's past. Remember that the Anglican Church was founded when Henry VIII split ties with the Pope because the latter would not grant an annulment. Writers like Keble, John Henry Newman, William Palmer, and others argued that Henry's Reformed Church was actually more Catholic than Protestant from the very start. They believed Anglican liturgies resembled medieval ones and petitioned for the revival of these ancient customs. Tractarians also resurrected and promoted the writings of early church fathers and believed that the Church of England should draw their doctrine from them rather than a modernist agenda. It's important to note that while the Tractarians believed their tracts told the true history of the Anglican Church, they were wrong. They rewrote their history, making Thomas Cranmer and the Book of Common Prayer appear more Roman than they actually were. The Oxford movement tried to root the Church of England in a longer line of history and reaffirm its ties to Rome. This was false authenticity, and instead historical reconstruction that reflected current frustrations with liberalism and the government. While the Oxford movement remained a minority within the larger Church of England, there were some important consequences. With the return to early church writings came an emphasis on ceremony and highly stylized ritual. Ornate vestments, incense, and more sacraments were ways of restoring the long-lost medieval liturgies. Naturally, this led to the discovery of early sources like Gregorian chant and medieval texts. After all, Keble and Newman were also poets and translators. Tractarians rediscovered the Roman breviary, a book of music and prayers for daily offices. At this time, congregational hymn singing in the Anglican Church wasn't as developed as other denominations in England. By translating older hymns and writing new ones, musical circles associated with the Oxford movement helped to develop this practice. One example of original poetry comes from the Tractarian Foliot Sandford Pierpont. Perhaps his most famous contribution is For the Beauty of the Earth, which he wrote while gazing into the beautiful view atop a hill outside his city of Bath. Now, a major figure of this movement was John Henry Newman, who started as an Anglican priest and converted to Roman Catholicism. One of his most popular hymns is the poem Lead Kindly Light, which he wrote in the middle of a tumultuous voyage. After his conversion to Roman Catholicism, Newman authored a large poem, The Dream of Gerontius, from which comes the lyrics, Praise to the Holiest in the Height. In fact, Edward Elgar penned a large work for choir and orchestra based on this poem. The Tractarians' return to early sources naturally led to the revival of Latin music, and poets were busy translating hundreds of medieval texts into English. Edward Caswall was another Anglican priest turned Catholic. He translated the Roman breviary and missal in its 1849 publication Lyra Catholica. Medieval hymns and sequences are recast as English poetry, and Caswall wrote these for daily devotional use, not necessarily to be sung in worship. His translations were not direct and word for word, but poetic, as seen in this rendition of Dies Irae, or Pangelingua. Caswall praised these medieval hymns to be superior for their emphasis on God, not the individual. His preface is a rather blunt critique of other hymns of the time, claiming that they aim at something more than merely exciting the feelings. They have a perpetual reference to action. Their character is eminently objective. In this respect, they utterly differ from the hymn books of modern heretical bodies, which, dwelling as they do almost entirely on the state and emotions of the individual, tend to inculcate the worst of all egotisms. As far as original poetry, Caswall is best known for the Christmas hymn See Amid the Winter Snow, which he published in a large collection of sacred poetry. John Mason Neale was another prolific medieval translator. His medieval hymns and sequences shows one influence from the Oxford movement, the return to old Latin texts. In his hymnal noted, the original chant melodies are set to Neale's lyrics, which, like Caswall's, are poetic translations. Notice the kind of faux chant notation used. Some of his most famous contributions come from his work with Pie Canciones, a book compiled by a cathedral headmaster in Finland. It contains old Latin and Swedish hymns and reflects songs that might have been sung in cathedral schools. Some were religious, like Resonatinalibus, and others secular, like Tempus Adest Floridium, the tune of which would become Good King Wenceslas. This rediscovery of Pie Canciones was a collaboration between Neale as translator and his colleague Thomas Helmore, who transcribed the medieval melodies into modern notation. The duo published a subset of these songs as carols for Christmastide, creating English hymns like Christ Was Born on Christmas Day, Good King Wenceslas, and Good Christian Men Rejoice. It's also worth mentioning that Neale contributed so many translations we sing today, like O Come, O Come Emmanuel, Of the Father's Love Begotten, and All Glory, Laud, and Honor, all of which are originally Latin hymns. As far as tunes, one notable composer was John Bacchus Dykes. Though not directly involved in the Oxford movement, Dykes was an Anglican priest and organist, and later became Anglo-Catholic. He paired Newman's Praise to the Holiest in the Height with a new tune, Drontius, creating the version we sing today. He also wrote many tunes we sing today. While many hymns from this time are chants or metricized versions, the newly composed tunes are certainly of their time. Today we might deem them sentimental for close chromatic neighbors and gooey melodies. However, if you compare this to other church music of the time by John Goss and John Stainer, the tunes were composed to be highly expressive. Many harmonic tricks were also used by continental composers like Schubert and Mendelssohn. Finally, one major, though indirect consequence of the Oxford movement was hymns ancient and modern, first published in 1861. Tractarian poets and their associated circles created hundreds of new hymns in the vernacular. All of these songs needed a place to go, and there was no national English hymnal. The hymnal included songs of all periods and denominations, but included sizable contributions from John Mason Neale, Edward Caswall, and translated German hymns of Catharine Winkworth. Now, let's sing one of John Mason Neale's translations. The 12th century monk Bernard of Cluny wrote a long satirical poem in Latin about the corruption he saw around him. A few verses early on in the poem talk about the beauty and glory of heaven to contrast with the shortcomings that Bernard attacks. Neale translated the Latin into English, and the Scottish composer Alexander Ewing eventually set it to music.